Any other questions? You guys good? All right. I'm gonna jump into the EQ section. So you see that a couple ways to control that. There's obviously this nice little EQ band here, EQ controls here. It's gonna show me the 3 knobs that I have, at least in the current configuration, for each band of the EQ, and then I can control those here by choosing low, mid, or high, which just selects on the screen as I do that. So that's that. Then I also have this nice little graph that's showing me kind of a visual representation of what that EQ is doing. So if I go to my high mid and I crank the gain up, I can see the gain here and I can see the actual change on that screen. So that's kind of the primary way you'll use that, but you can also either tap on there or you can actually tap sometimes where you get the exact same view either way. But now I'm looking at that EQ just in a more blown up view like we've seen other places. And so there's some great little tools underneath the hood here that we'll look at that are gonna be helpful to us. So I love this view because it gives me kind of everything that I could possibly use in the world of EQ is on this screen right now, looking at this pop-up. Where here I kind of see, I get the big picture of what's going on, but I can obviously see what's going on with my compressors and everything else. But if I really want to dive into EQ, it's nice to just pull that up and get the full view. So here you can see it's kind of broken up a little bit different. It's got low, mid, high. And again, those just follow with whichever I want to have selected. And here I get a little bit more control of it. So let's talk about just the types of EQ that we have. So I'm gonna grab the high mid again and just boost that up. This shape right here, this is kind of like a bell curve, right? That is what we call just a generic, that's a parametric EQ band. So I can turn that up or down and it's just gonna equally adjust all frequencies above and below my selected frequency. So right now that high mid is set to 2.8K, and so that's the center, and then it's just gonna equally bring up everything around it. Now with those parametric EQs, I get 3 total controls, gain, frequency, and then this one's either called Q or bandwidth. And so what I can do with this is actually just narrow how many frequencies around that center frequency I want to adjust with it. Whether that's positive or negative, I can tighten up and say, I really want to only cut out this really narrow band, or I want to take a ton of stuff with it, okay? General concept of this parametric makes sense. Any questions on that? All right, carry on. Okay, so the high mid and the low mid, that's all they can do. They can only be a parametric band. They can be exactly what you just saw and nothing more. Now you can choose independent gain and frequency and Q, and even though they're labeled high, mid, low, low, mid, high, and high, well, nice things is it's digital. I could put my high mid at 20 hertz and use it way down here, or I could use it at 20 kilohertz. It doesn't matter. I'm not tied to anything as to like what frequency range I can use those in. I can put them wherever the heck I want, which is great. So where in analog, a lot of times you're really limited, like I only have this range I can use my high mid, and this range I can use my low mid, and it was just a narrow window. Here I can put it wherever I want. So I could use all 4 of them down the low end if I felt some strange need to. Okay, so that's all I can do with my high mid and low mid is just use them as a parametric band. My high and low have a few more options as to what type of filter they actually are. So by default on this console, it boots up with the low and the high both set as shelves. So rather than a parametric band, this is going to be a shelf. So if I'm on the low, it's a low shelf. If I'm on the high, it's a high shelf. So I'm just going to show you what a low shelf looks like. That's what a low shelf looks like. You'll see that rather than having a parametric bell shape and only picking up kind of one frequency and the frequencies around it, a shelf is going to boost everything. In the case of a low shelf, it's going to equally boost or cut everything below my selected frequency. So same if I cut, it's going to do just like that, and you'll see that that center frequency and everything below it is going to get reduced by that same amount. So by default, you get the low shelf and the high shelf on those 2 things. So again, high is going to work just like we just saw there. And I can go positive or negative. I'm just going to boost everything around that. Now, in this console, I actually have multiple different flavors of EQ that I can choose from. Bigger picture, so I'm going to take just a second to show you that. I rarely ever use anything else. I'm not super, some people are super picky, like, oh, I really want this style EQ. I don't care. The Precise is what they call this one, but they have one called Aggressive and Smooth and Legacy. Those change some things about like what you get. The Precise is what it defaults to. I never change it. Some people are like, oh, I like the sound of this EQ better. I think EQ's EQ, and I can make it work with whichever tool you give me. So know that that's there, but you don't have to change it. But that'll change some of the options of what you get in terms of these filters. But I'm going to show you what everything we can do with Precise. So with that Precise, you'll see that in that shelf, I still do have a bandwidth control, so I can actually adjust the shape of that shelf a bit. So you see I can like make that a much more gradual shelf, or I can make it really, really, really steep. as it enters into that filter. So I have a wide variety of options available to me. So that's really the core of it, is just showing you that you can adjust just like with the parametrics, I can adjust the shape of that a little bit, which is nice. So shelves, any questions on shelves before I move on? Okay. Like I said, by default, the high and low both are shelves, but for each of them, there's just a button here. So this is my low. I can turn my low from a shelf back to a parametric, so just by tapping that button. And so now that goes back to just a generic parametric. Tap it again, and it's a shelf. Get the same thing over here on the right for my high frequency. And I can tap that, turn that off, and now it becomes parametric. Turn that back on, and now I've got a high shelf. Okay. So the last band of EQ that we haven't talked about, because it's not technically part of the EQ, but it behaves as part of the EQ, is the high pass filter. So you've got a knob for it right here on the console. You've got an on-off button for it here. You can see what that knob is currently doing, and I've got some options as to the slope of that. So turn that on. So high pass filter, where it's called a high pass filter because it lets the high frequencies pass. Now it's adjustable. I can choose at what frequency I want it to engage. And what I'm doing is adjusting out taking out all of the low end at a specific frequency. So turn this on, listen to it, and I'm gonna way overuse that. So you can see right there, sounds super thin, doesn't sound good at all. And I can roll it back to where it starts to sound like a normal human being again, and there'll be a happy medium in there somewhere where it's cleaning up some really extreme low end. So if I turn it off, there may just be more boominess down low that's not beneficial. So if I turn that on, it's just cleaning up a little bit of that, but I still sound like me. So that's a high pass filter. That's the thing that I use on like 90% of channels. I'm going to turn a high pass on at some point just to clean up any stuff below where the actual like range of that instrument or voice or whatever it is. I'm going to use that just to clean up so I'm not hearing any extreme low end that could be picked up by that microphone. I'm just hearing what I want to hear out of that actual source that I'm listening to. So that's usually actually my first step in the EQ is turn that on and adjust it to find the right position, and then I move from there. So I want to just show you what those different EQ types sound like. So here's a high shelf. You get the idea. I'm using an extreme condition so you really hear it. And I'm adding a lot of that high frequency so you can hear what that sounds like. It's nasty and we don't like it. And then I can show you a negative shelf where I'm going to take some of that high frequency away. You can hear how the signal is getting dark and hard to understand. So that's what shelf does. If I make that a parametric, instead of boosting all frequencies, it's just going to boost that center frequency. Then I can slide where that happens and what frequencies I'm boosting. Make that really narrow, which is going to sound weird to my ears. Narrow, positive EQ always sounds funny to your ears because you're hearing such a sharp amount and such a narrow band of frequencies that's been boosted. It sounds pretty unnatural. Whereas something wider, not that extreme, won't jump out as, now this doesn't sound great, but it doesn't sound as bad to my ears as when I make that really narrow. It kind of throws your head for a loop sometimes. But in terms of cutting, really narrow cuts can actually be super useful to cut something that's not a good sound without having to take away everything else. So I like to think first with EQ about taking away what sounds bad before I think about adding what is lacking. Yep. So I like to take a signal and say, what do I need less of to start? If somebody's going to cutting less of some things and adding more of it, that's fine. I just like to think first about that piece of what am I gonna take away. Okay, so another trick that I'll show you what I like to do is for a lot of channels, what I'll use is a high pass filter, but then I'm actually going to use just a standard parametric band. Try to high pass filter off so you can see that. So I'll use a normal parametric, and I'm actually going to place that frequency wise just above my high pass filter, so that I'm getting kind of this shape, which can a lot of times allow me, in a good way, to run my high pass filter a little bit lower and still clean up some of the low end above the high pass without having to high pass all of that audio out. And so if I turn both off, you'll hear all that extra low end that comes back. I turn both of those back on, and it just cleans it up a little bit to help with intelligibility and keep it from being super bass heavy. So I like to, a lot of times, like I said, just use a little bit of a low cut just above my high pass filter to just clean up some stuff right above the high pass filter, so I can run my high pass filter at a lower frequency. Any questions on EQ so far? I have 2 more things to show you in here. Okay, one really nice thing in this EQ, let me just do this before I move on. So one thing we've got here on the high ends, the high end can be either a parametric band or a shelf, or it has one other option right here which you can turn on, which is called a low pass filter. So just like a high pass filter is going to truly cut out all the low end, that's what a low pass filter is going to do for high frequency. So not something I would normally use on a vocal because I want to hear all that beautiful intelligibility of being able to understand what someone's saying is happening up top. So I need to keep all that for vocal. But there are plenty of cases of instruments and things where I may want to do this. And so, big picture thinking of mixing, one of the things that I like to teach is that mixing is, again, more than just volume, more than just mixing volumes to get something to sit in a good place relative to another source, but actually using EQ to shape where different instruments fit in the mix it together. So one thing I like to think through is as I'm mixing, as I'm starting to just listen to inputs, if I've got many sources in the mix that are making a lot of high frequency sound, I know that can be a long-term problem of having too many things making high frequencies that's going to sit on top of that region where the clarity of my vocals comes from. And so I'm going to use things like EQ to clean up sources that could potentially conflict and sit on top of my vocals and to potentially make space for them. So things like electric guitars. Electric guitars can be super full range. They make low end, they make mid range, they make high end. There's not a frequency that is not made by an electric guitar when it's a good sounding guitar, and a good sounding amp and pedals and the whole kit. But a lot of times that high frequency, that if it's playing a guitar solo and all I'm listening to is that guitar, I want to hear the full range of the whole thing. But in the context of a mix, I'm trying to find what of this guitar fits well and doesn't step on other things. And so by using things like a low pass filter to take off the very high end of it, I'm making more space for when I just turn the vocal up next to that guitar, I'm gonna be able to hear what the words that are being said over top of that guitar without them fighting each other. And so instead of it being let me just turn the vocal up more so I hear it more, I'm actually saying, let me find what of this other instrument is conflicting with the guitar and let me listen to less of that.
So would you use that then, say like on an acoustic with a pick on the strings where you get that really scrapey sound?
What's funny is I actually don't like some of that scrapey sound on
the acoustic.
You need
some of it for the
character of it. And some of it's being able to just like in the mix, I still kind of want that to shine through to be able to hear the actual pick on the strings on an acoustic. So that's one of the things that for me, I actually like to leave that almost bright in that high end but if I'm careful with all the other things in the mix, I can have room to have my acoustics jump through like that and have my vocals and let them both live up in that high frequency range. But I'm finding other places to cut. But I just like that on an acoustic. But if you don't have to. So you can. I think an electric is less diminished and loses less by low passing it than something like an acoustic does. You're going to lose a lot of the sound of an acoustic if you do that. Whereas an electric, I can go knock the top end of it off. It's still going to sound like an electric guitar. It's just going to sound like it's a little bit darker, but it's not going to sound weird. Whereas if I lose all that sound on an acoustic, it's going to stop sounding like an acoustic at some point. Mm-hmm. So I really like it on electrics. You'll find other cases where you may want to use a low pass, but it's really nice if you want to truly just chop it off. So honestly, my starter EQ on a lot of electric guitars is basically, an aggressive high pass and aggressive low pass, and I just kind of let those, I'm going to shaping in saying this is what I want to hear on the guitar, and then once I hear it, I'll play with it and say, I want more low end of that, or I want more high end, and I'll just play with it around until it feels right, but I'm going to just tinker with all that until I'm happy with how that sounds. Another really, really nice thing on this console is that you've got these little bypass buttons for every band. So rather than have to turn the whole EQ off, if I want to hear just like the effect of this one filter, I can just hit bypass and tinker it on and off. So even if I had a bunch of other EQ doing stuff that I was happy with on this channel, I can still just be playing with this one and bypass it to listen to A/B it without having to turn the whole EQ off, which is nice. So that button's, not every console has that, so I'm a big fan of the little bypass switch there. You'll see this RTA. That's this whole thing where you can see this nice picture of what frequencies are making noise. So that's called the RTA, real-time analyzer. It's literally just showing where, how much volume each frequency is making right now when I talk. And I think this is post EQ in that when when I make a change, you'll actually see that change happen on that graph. So it's going to show me like the real world conditions. After I've made my changes, I'm going to see what that does to the response of it. The thing where this is a huge tool that even I like rely on all the time is if I'm ever fighting feedback on a signal, knowing exactly precisely at what frequency that feedback is occurring is a really powerful tool. I don't have to rely on my ear to say, I may be able to spot about where that frequency is, but using this I can know exactly where that feedback's happening. So let's see if we can, hey, let's make this feedback